Again, we're going to tag up with the topic from last week. It's about cultivated liberality. Right after that, Jill gave me an article from a devotional book she had. And it's talk about the sacrifices that are acceptable to God. What are the acceptable sacrifices to God? The contrite and broken spirit fits perfectly with this idea of cultivation. Cultivated means to turn over the ground. I don't know much about farming, but I remember seeing my great-grandpa and others hook up a mule to that big old cultivating plow, that big rolled thing with the point on the end of it, and breaking ground with it. And that's exactly what this is about, cultivated liberality, breaking ground. I want us to begin this. If you would turn with me to Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 9. When we talk about cultivation in light of turning over the ground, that's exactly what God is talking about. After the restoration of Israel following the captivity, He is turning again to them to bless them. Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 9. For behold, I am for you, and I will turn to you, and you will be cultivated and sown. What's he saying? I'm going to turn to you, but you're going to be turned also. He's got to plow in their hearts. He's got to be able to plant in their hearts. And so what's going to be the result of that? Verse 10, I will multiply men on you and all the house of Israel, all of it, and the cities will be inhabited, and the waste places will be rebuilt. I will multiply on you man and beast, and they will increase and be fruitful. I will cause you to be inhabited as you were formerly, and will treat you better than at the first. What's the result? Thus you will know I am the Lord. There's a process there. It's happened from the beginning, hasn't it? There's always this process. God brings out a people, seeks to turn them to serve Him, and whether they continue to do that or not, there's still this process. When they have failed, He's turning to them again. And it's all about turning proud and rebellious Israelites into servants. And so by God they're turned into a servant, by God they're sown, then by God the branches and bear fruit which benefits others, and by all of that then they know that I am is the Lord. And so from the beginning, by all that God says and does, sometimes, most of the time for the people, and sometimes when He has to against the people, it is to turn them over. He's sowing into these people this conviction that He is the great I am. That's really a cultivated truth. To those who understand it are servants. Those people who don't have the mindset of expecting to be served. They're not demanding to be served. They're not complaining if they're not served. But they're giving their all to serve God. Now, other than Jesus, give me a New Testament example of someone like that, who wasn't expecting to be served, but rather was giving all to serve God. Some of you have mentioned her while we've been talking about stewardship. We don't know her name, but she's described as the poor widow, isn't she? The poor widow. The word poor there means and is translated in some places as utterly destitute. Let's turn to Mark chapter 12, verse 41 through 44. Mark 12, verse 41 through 44. And this evening I'm going to be reading it from the American Standard Version because I think they put a marvelous color on this and in a way that makes it clear. Mark chapter 12, verse 41. The context here, Jesus is observing the mindset and the habits of the Pharisees. Verse 41. And he sat down over against the treasury, and beheld how the multitude cast money into the treasury. And many that were rich cast in much. And there came a poor widow, and she cast in 2 mites, which makes a farthing. And he called unto him his disciples, and said unto them, Verily I say unto you, this poor widow cast in more than all they that are casting into the treasury. For they all did cast of their I can't say it this evening. Superfluity. There we go. Superfluity. But she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living. I think superfluity is a great way to say it. What's it remind you of? Superfluous. What if something's superfluous? Do you care if you have it or not? Do you care if you lose it or not? I mean, that's like money you'd, just walk along throwing over your shoulder. They could throw it over their shoulder all day and not miss it. But she is giving all that she had. This word for poor is the exact same one we find in Matthew 5 and verse 3 in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Jesus isn't talking about how poor financially. He's first talking about the heart. He said, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Because why is the kingdom of heaven theirs? Because the only way they know they have entrance into heaven is by the grace of God. And it really describes a whole class of people who are giving themselves over to Jesus' teaching, and they proving themselves the kind of people who are fit to lay hold of their heavenly treasure. What you thinking about, Jill?
I've written this, I've underlined poor in spirit, and I've written under a sense of being inadequate.
Poor in spirit? Well, she certainly knows she's totally inadequate. She, not just in the providing for herself, but as a matter of faith, her poor in spirit, she knows by giving up her life, she knows her life is Christ. Apart from God, she doesn't have any life. He is her life. Certainly, I think most all of us ought to realize by now that apart from Christ, we don't have life, do we?
We like to be that we are inadequate in a lot of ways. We don't like that one.
No. But
we don't like
but it is a very good word.
Yeah.
Because to inherit the treasures of heaven, not a one of us here is adequate. And so if we are going to do that, how so? God has to be her life, our life, yes.
I have a note that I have written by that scripture means emptiness, where God can fill their heart. Bless the poor in spirit, because their heart is empty. God can fill it empty of their self.
We talked about it several weeks back in another chapter of this book, the concept of a vessel. You come to as a vessel, willing, ready to be filled. That plays into this devotional thought that Joe gave me as well. There's an old song that says, Spirit of the Lord, living Lord, fall fresh on me, break me, melt me, mold me, fill me. That's what has to happen. And this poor widow, really, it's not a great description of her, is it? Because really she is rich towards God, isn't it? Rich in heart towards God. How much did she cast? Even all that she had. So the contrast is superfluity, which cost them nothing, versus her poverty in spirit, which cost her everything, even all her living. She would be one that we read about in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 5, a widow indeed. At least implying that she didn't have a husband, she didn't have any sons that would care for her. So she's being completely provided for, food and clothing, whatever else she need out of this church treasury. But more so than that, you see what's so good about her heart? She hadn't taken on this mindset, oh, woe is me, everybody owes me, everybody you got it. No, what's her mindset? She's not excusing herself from giving. No, she knows she owes her life to God, to the great I am. Now, even though the mite was the smallest division of currency, I mean, it's really worth far less than our pennies today, which cost a whole lot more than a penny to make. So, what is he commending in her? Not the face value of the coins, but the ideal value of the coin. Face value is not worth much. Ideal value to God is a treasure. Yes, June?
He's commending her for the faith that she has, that he will take care of her. She's trusting him.
And because of that faith, there's this selfless quality. You see, he's not concerned about quantity, is he? But the quality of the heart. If you'll go with me to 1 John chapter 3 and verse 17. 1 John 3 and verse 17. John's making the same kind of case here. Whoever has the world's good and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. We will know by this that we are of the truth, and will assure our heart before him. And whatever our heart condemns us, for our God is greater than our heart and knows all things. I like the verse in there. And we will assure our heart before him. They are sure that they are going to possess that treasure they've laid up in heaven. It's this selfless quality, not about quantity. You know, there is in many realms a problem with this notion of quantity, that if I give more, if I do more and more and more than anybody else does, then I'm assured of heaven. Well, God is commending the spiritual quality of her deeds. It's why he asked the Pharisees, which is greater? Remember that, Matthew 23 and verse 19. Matthew 23 and verse 19, Jesus is, the questions that he asked the Pharisees in response to their challenging everything he says, those questions are amazing. And that really what he asked, they cannot honestly answer. Matthew 23 and verse 19. I'll start in verse 18. Whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. What's he talking about? He's about to make the point about himself. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the altering? The altar that sanctifies the offering. What's he comparing there? Who's the altar that sanctifies? See, even the meaning is veiled to the Pharisees. They can't answer that. The altar that sanctifies is Jesus Christ himself. Once Jesus made that once for all sacrifice on the cross, he became our altar. We don't have an altar today. This furniture is not an altar. Jesus Christ is. His sacrifice is the altar. Well, they can't answer that question, can they? They really can't. Because the meaning is veiled. He's asking, which is greater, your gold or my sacrifice of blood? Now, they're not going to answer that. And so, the altar that sanctifies refers to Jesus' lifeblood. Christ did away with that Old Testament altar. Well, the Pharisees can give from their superfluity of gold, but the real value, that's what Jesus is always measuring. That's what he's always weighing, is the real value. It's Christ's blood. What happens in, not only with the Pharisees, but often happens with religious folks, particularly those who presume themselves quite powerful, they reverse the order, don't they? They see the gold that is that which sets us apart to God. Not so. How many ways does that really get messed up? Be thinking about it, because that gets messed up so many ways, where the amount of the gift supersedes, at least in man's mind, the value of Christ's sacrifice. It was interesting, came to mind just today. You know, men have this concept that if you give enough, if you do enough, that you can buy your way into the kingdom of God. The issue came up with Paul in Acts 22 and verse 18 regarding his citizenship in Rome. And, well, how did he get that citizenship? They assumed, well, it was bought with a price. And it was. You could buy that. There's still places today. If you want to live as an expat in some other country, you can buy citizenship there. You just got to have enough money in the bank. Same with Rome. But you cannot, that's not going to get you into the kingdom. It works in Rome, but not in the church. So Jesus makes clear it is he that sanctifies the giver. Now, getting back to a principle of stewardship then. The poor widow knows that God can take, just as he described in Ezekiel 36, God can take the smallest gift, sanctify it, send it forth, multiply it in the eternal value of souls saved. You know, we see it even in the concept of something about if just a cup of water you give to someone. Seems like it's a small thing, doesn't cost anything. But it can have a surpassing value to God's glory. Yes?
I was thinking about that in 23 what they had neglected to do, the waiting provisions, justice and mercy.
Yep.
But I know I can't remember it's that in the Old Testament. Did he say sacrifice and burnt offering I
Did not desire. But what?
what?
Sorry about that. I was just banging on the microphone.
That was whenever Saul made that sacrifice when he shouldn't have been Samuel.
In many ways, he says it.
And it's also
Not your sacrifices, but your compassion, but your heart for others.
So it's like, you know, like we've talked about before, that they know that what was said, you know, in the Old Testament.
Yep.
And so, you know, the justice and the mercy, you know, that's what Jesus Christ is all about.
And it really gets right to that. It touches on what we've been talking about in the Gospel of Mark. You know, that whole Pharisaical and scribal attitude, that's merciless business. That's just merciless. I mean, they're giving nothing to God or to people. Rather, they seek to prevent God from blessing anyone. Just merciless stuff. But think about her. She understands, you know, God's spiritual economic system. The littlest gifts, we don't know which one, and it might be added to some other little gift, but it may win a soul, and that soul may win 10,000 more. That's what he's talking about in Ezekiel 36. Think about her. She's the one in the crowd that's least able to give, but the one who is most willing to give. And this is really a biblical constant. You see it throughout the Bible. The one who has least to give will often give the most. And so that makes this poor widow a type. She's the kind of people, the kind of believer that is so valuable to God. Not those who think they're big and great and they can, she certainly doesn't have the attitude of the Laodiceans do, because they just boast about how much money they spend. They can throw money on church programs, but what did they think they were doing? They thought by the money spent they were making themselves holy, that they were being set apart to God. It's the sense that they thought they were buying their way into heaven. Not so. Yes.
I was going to say too, when the widow gave the last of what she had, her heart had to have been so humble to be able to give everything that she had left or had, at all. It just makes it makes me just think about when we give, how do we give? Are we given to be recognized that we gave something? Are we given because we're humbling ourselves before God to give? Because so many times people want to have you see what they're doing. Well, look what I just did, and this lady, it was all about God,
Well, that's what Jesus talked about in that passage in Mark chapter 4. Because the Pharisees made a big show of it. You take your heaviest coins and you throw it down that metallic horn and you make it rattle, and everybody knows what you gave. No. I've said it before in this study. Money doesn't keep anybody out of habit or out of heaven. What keeps them out of heaven is the refusal to suffer loss. They want to keep it all. Yes, Joe?
Well, that's one of the biggest things that you put on last week was time. People don't want to give their time in service to people.
This comes a little later, but I'll pull it up for right now. Where do we go to in the New Testament to talk about giving? Primarily, where do we go? 2 Corinthians, those 2 chapters. I didn't notice it till this week. We always go to that when we talk about giving money. Have you realized in those 2 chapters, Paul never mentions the word money? Did you notice it? Now the context is that. So why didn't he say that? What's Paul concerned about? The heart that has the grace to give it all. He's talking, it's not about quantity. Yes, they sent everything they could, but it's not about the quantity. It's about the heart change. Remember, he commends the Corinthians. By that time, they're doing so many things well. In their faith, in their love, in their unity, and in their worship. He's commending all these things they do so good, but he says, this one thing you lack, he's still got to turn that over. He still has to cultivate that in them. It's not just the money. You've asked a couple of times while we've studied this, Jill, does this apply to more than just money? Yes, it does. It does. It applies to, as you mentioned again, time, every ability that we have. That's what Paul's cultivating, this quality of a heart. Yeah, Jeff.
Well, in 2 Corinthians 8, where it talks about the Macedonians, the emphasis is they gave themselves first to the Lord.
That's the quality he's cultivating in the Corinthians.
Right.
And it's also that purpose in your heart. You make up your mind you're going to do this, and then you do it.
You know, that's quite a cultivation project in Corinth. I mean, these folks are well off. They are well off. And, you know, this is like their last stronghold of rebellion. Come on, just let us keep our money. We can, you know, all that other stuff, we can perform that. We can act loving to one another. We can eat meals with one another and all that. We can make a good show of that even. But this one thing. Yes, June?
And in verse 43, it's a big compliment to her that Christ calls his disciples and tells them what she did and what an example. And that makes a lesson to the disciples that Jesus knew her heart, knew what she was doing, knew that she gave everything, and that he wanted the disciples to know that.
Again, as Jesus so often does so well, the teaching is there, and then it's beautifully illustrated in plain old everyday common folks, isn't it? He'll see somebody and there's the example of it. Look at them. That's what he wants. It's not a calculation of quantity, but of quality. You know, some people are still giving as though it's a calculation, like still giving their mites rather than their life. And if we go back to Mark chapter 4, what are people forgetting there? Who's watching all of this? Who's watching? Jesus is sitting there watching them. He still knows. Watching. He sat down as the people gave into the treasury. It reminds me of a prayer that we often hear in our worship services. Jesus is observing what? Both the gift and the giver. What do we often pray? Lord, we pray you bless both the gift and the giver. Nothing wrong with the prayer, but it makes a mighty big assumption about the giver, doesn't it? Think about it. It makes a fair assumption about the giver. You're assuming, can God do that? If they have the heart of making some sort of calculation, financial calculation, but withholding their heart, he can't bless that. So really the prayer is that may we have that kind of heart so that he can bless both the gift and the giver. It is possible, it will be done when it is from our poverty of spirit that we are giving our life to God. He doesn't want all that we have for life. He wants our life itself. That takes some cultivation, really, doesn't it? Yes, Frank?
That's perfect opposite of where the rich young ruler had everything, but he could not give of his wealth. She had nothing, hardly, but she gave all that she had, and it was her heart.
And just as Mark 4 says, she gave far more than even that rich man could have given. If he'd said, okay, I won't build that bigger barn, all that excess I'll give to, well, that's still from the superfluity, isn't it? Hadn't really given anything if it's all from the excess. It's really a highly cultivated sense. Mac Layton from the book uses an illustration, the congregation where they needed to put a new roof on the building, and the one rich guy in the congregation says, well, I would give according to what everybody else gives. Sounds really generous to speak up first. I'll give as everybody else gives. What's the problem with that, Frank?
He had more than everybody else.
He had more ability.
Willing to give it up.
He had more ability. Well, as the story is told, there happened to be another new member in the town who had more money than him. So he challenged the first one. Well, brother, let's just the two of us pay for it all by ourselves. And that was closer to that man's ability. But he had been getting by with that for years. Well, I'll give what everybody else gives. But that was nothing. Yes, Jill?
Well, one of my sisters in Christ when I was not real, haven't been a Christian for a real long time, but she had asked me the question, do you want to follow the path of our theology? I said, oh, absolutely. Sure would. Are you willing to be strict? Are you willing to be beaten? Are you willing to be hung up? It's not comfortable, Joe. When you say that you're willing to give it all, do you really mean it? That's always stuck in my head when I start thinking, this is too hard. This is too hard. And I thought, no, it's not. It's not too hard.
A similar case in the congregation where my dad has worshiped for years, it's full of rich people. And it came time to put a new roof on all of their buildings. And there was this option for shingles cost this much, and a high-end metal roof cost even more. And the one rich brother says, well, we got to do the really expensive one because I need a bigger tax deduction. What's the problem? It's this calculation. So many ways that gets messed up. I know of one congregation that they withhold what they think the preacher ought to give. They would just withhold it from his salary. So what's that accomplish? The portion of the taxes that the congregation paid for him, they don't have to pay that. And he doesn't have to give. And that's exactly the point of this. That's exactly the point of this. Why didn't Jesus just give her the 2 mites back? For that reason. The tremendous blessing it was to her to know that she had laid it all out there.
What was it David said, the circumstance when he said it has to cost me something? I have to pay this because it has to cost me. And that's the bottom line. If it doesn't cost you anything, then does it really do anything? It's not the money. It's nothing. I was reading in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 15. It says, for all things are for your sakes, that the grace which is spreading to more and more people may cause the giving of thanks to abound to the glory of God. Therefore we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, for the things which are not seen are eternal. And sometimes this time seems like it's more than a light affliction. You know, sometimes it's pretty painful, but it really is compared to what Christ went through, compared to the grace that's been lavishly presented to us and just dumped on us. Our cup really does overflow. Even in our most trying times, our cup is still full if we empty that cup of ourselves and let God fill us up.
What's Paul cultivating in those Corinthians? Again, the heart. Still, what's the verse that devotional was from? What's acceptable to God? The sacrifices of a broken and contrite heart. He's still plowing that heart. That's what he wants. The heart. Yes.
I was going to say too, you know, the widow, when she gave all she had to have known that no matter what, God is going to take care of her needs. She's going to be taken care of by giving whatever she needs. You know, I'm not saying that she became wealthy or anything, but for whatever she needed, that she must have had the faith to know that God would take care of her.
Well, in her mind, what does she need more than anything?
Him.
Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's what she has.
And that's what,
It's what Jesus was
She
saying,
had.
be anxious for nothing.
Yeah.
Because doesn't, you know, God takes care of the sparrows. Aren't you worth more than the sparrow? So we need to remember that.
Well, on that note about God wanting our heart, I thought this evening after Jeff's devotional, we'll sing number 672. It is about exactly what God requires. Give me thy heart, says the Father above. The verse goes with it, for where your treasure is, there your heart is also.